The idea of working in a pod has been discussed in our industry for years, and there's a big debate on whether or not it makes sense. We implemented pods where I work about 6 months ago, and in this episode, I'm going to share how it's going, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So stick around. So in this episode, we're going to be breaking down the pod structure, the pros and the cons, based on my experience firsthand implementing pods over the last 6 months. First off, what is a pod? A pod is like a mini company within a company. A small group of BDOs, underwriters, closers, and BDAs. We're talking one, maybe two of each per pod. And this was actually my second time trying pods. We tried it at my last company as well. A lot of companies consider the pod structure, especially as they grow to like 10 plus people in each division. And that's because there's many benefits to working in smaller groups. So let's go over those first. Smaller teams are able to build connections easier, and you can pair folks that work well together. So from the BDO's perspective, having one underwriter is a great way to make the whole team more efficient because over time, you know exactly what that underwriter is looking for, and you can adjust your upfront work to cover more of the underwriter's questions and make their job easier and get to an approval quicker. There's also less room for surprise decline once you have a really solid understanding of your underwriter's credit philosophy, which you're going to get to that point a lot quicker if you're just working with the same underwriter over and over. Same goes for a closer. Let's face it, closing is the hardest part of the process, and having a closer that you trust is key. It's very hard to build that sort of relationship when your deals are spread across 5 different closers. And also, different closers handle things in different ways. And when you're doing your upfront selling, you're going to want to be able to explain the closing process with greater certainty. And you can do that if you have just one closer. So now when I go to market, I feel way more confident when I quote underwriting turn times and explain the closing process. Now, from the underwriter standpoint, and we touched on this in last week's episode when I interviewed my very own underwriter. He knows what he's getting from me. He knows what my write-ups look like, and he can do his job more efficiently. And he's also setting up the closer for success by anticipating their wants and their needs, and that makes the transition to closing go smoother. The closer's life is easier too, since they don't have 8 different BDOs reaching out to them every single day. All of this drives efficiency, which is great for the company and the individuals. Finally, there's just something about breaking off into teams that creates a camaraderie. I saw this as one of the great advantages to pods. Often sales will form their own team, and then credit has its team, and closing has their team, and you can see the walls starting to go up between these different departments. But with a pod, the team that's being created is the team that's working together every single day in the trenches, side by side, one another. And then you start building these bridges between sales and credit and closing counterparts, which is way healthier. That's what you want, right? We like to take it a step further in our pod. We named our pod. It's called the GOAT Pod. And the amount of branding and slogans and pod puns that we've come up with is just endless. We've made t-shirts. It's a whole big thing. We have a weekly pipeline call and then a monthly call to go over big picture strategy for the pod. And we're basically treating our pod like a company, focused on driving efficiency, keeping the pod members happy, and improving the customer experience. Now, here are the downsides. Let's say a BDO in one pod has 2 deals to submit this week, and another BDO in another pod has no deals to submit. To stay true to the pod, you have to give those 2 deals to that dedicated underwriter, and the other underwriter in the other pod sitting there on their hands waiting for their BDO to submit a deal. And that's a hard pill to swallow for a company. But if you split the deals up, and were to give one to each underwriter, go outside the pod, then when their BDO submits something the following week, their underwriter might still be working on the other pod's deal, and it just throws everything off. So if you're going to do pods, do pods. We experienced this issue, and our solution was basically to have a floater, someone who can come into a pod to help with excess capacity as needed. But this problem is 10 times worse when it comes to closing, because when you assign a deal to a closer, they have that deal for 1, 2, sometimes 3 months. So staying true to the pod is even more important. So when my closer has 10 deals and another pod's closer has 5 deals, it's really hard to assign that closer an 11th deal. And this is where a lot of companies get tripped up. But once you start assigning deals outside the pod based on that sort of logic, you're basically sabotaging the whole pod structure. Now, that busy pod may need a second closer, or perhaps a floater that can go between two different pods, but you can't just start round-robining deals to closers based on capacity, because then you're back to a normal non-pod structure. And so unless you fully 100% embrace the pod structure, it's not going to work. The other downside is that you're stuck with who you've got. Let's face it, every company has high performers, average performers, and low performers. And putting the pods together can be quite a controversial exercise. Everyone's going to want that one underwriter or that one closer or that nice BDO that knows their deal. And if you have a BDO that's a little too pushy, or an underwriter that's a little too slow, or a new closer that isn't quite up to speed, there's not much you can do. All I can say is to make better hires and have a top-notch training program in place, because that's going to be a problem whether you have pods or not. Now, whether or not a company is saving money by using this approach is very hard to say. And when you're in upper management and you see your underwriters or closers in some of the pods that are not busy, you can't help but think about that ginormous salary and wage expense line on the P&L. But what our company has seen is less declines, which means you're more efficient, and more volume. And that's a lot harder to track as a direct result of the pod. But I can tell you that having a dedicated underwriter is a huge advantage for me out in the field. And honestly, it motivates me to submit a deal to underwriting every single week so that I keep that underwriter busy. Because if a couple weeks go by and I haven't submitted a deal, which has yet to happen, we're going to have to reconsider whether I need my own underwriter, or if maybe this underwriter can support me and one other BDO. And I could tell you for sure that motivates me to go out and find the next deal. So those are some of the main pros and cons to consider. One other thing to consider is how hard it is to hire and retain talent in our industry. Do you think having pods will help or hurt you? And I guess that depends, right? I can tell you that as somebody in a healthy pod, it will be really hard for me to recreate this kind of setup as a BDO somewhere else. So in that sense, it helps. But if I hated my team and I was stuck with them, perhaps that would push me out a little bit faster. So let's call that one a net neutral. One thing is for sure, pods are a great way to experiment. You can test out a new process in a pod, and a pod can also innovate on their own, which can be shared across the entire company if it works. And so pods are a great way for larger companies to stay nimble and maintain an entrepreneurial culture as they grow larger. Well, that pretty much wraps up this podcast. See what I did there? All right, that's it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode of The Art of SBA Lending. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, email me at ray@artofsba.com. Until next time, ta-ta.